KLFY uncovers and digs deeper into the untold stories of missing persons, strange disappearances, cold cases, and mysteries from the heart of Acadiana. Beal and Hebert present Cajun Case Files, a KLFY Plus original.
Welcome to Cajun Case Files. I'm your host, Britt LaFaso. Innocence in Justice, Louisiana started in 2001. Since then, they've brought home 47 innocent people from Louisiana and Mississippi that were convicted of and served sentences for. They picked up Daniel Prince's case in 2021. They were looking at cases with DNA angles. Can someone's innocence be proven by testing collected evidence? They initially looked at Daniel's case because there was a lot of evidence and no forensic evidence ever linked to Daniel to the murders of Jackie and Angie. As they looked into the case, they realized this might not be a DNA case, but they had a lot of questions about the fairness of his trial and about Daniel's guilt. They did scorched earth investigation into the records. Today, they believe Daniel is innocent, and they are fighting to prove that. I sat down with staff attorney Zach Crawford about their case.
Some of the evidence that was presented in trial, we have this alleged confession to Michael Hayes. Daniel Prince allegedly made this confession about a year after the murders of Angie and Jackie. And he only knew Michael for about 6 days, if I have that right. This is a very detailed confession that Michael Hayes gave investigators. Can you speak to this alleged confession at all? Because there was a lot of questions brought up about this confession in trial.
Yes, as there should be. You mentioned that he had known Michael Hayes for about 6 days. Really, Michael Hayes sort of had the good fortune of getting moved to the same prison as Mr. Prince. And within 6 days, he was reaching out to the state fire marshal to say, hey, this guy has confessed to me. Now, what's problematic there is that, and your viewers will probably or hopefully remember that in the facts of this case, the victims are 2 women. In his first statement that Mr. Hayes gave to the state fire marshal, he said, Danny Prince has told me that he murdered a man and his girlfriend, a young man and his girlfriend that he met at a bar. And that just simply does not match the facts at all. Yet, the state fire marshal still decided to turn Mr. Hayes into a state agent. A few days later, Mr. Hayes was given a wire to wear and sent back in with instructions to get information about the murders from Mr. Prince. He attempted to talk to Mr. Prince. Mr. Prince did not give any sort of a confession on the wiretapping, and they had to take the wire off. A few days after that, Mr. Hayes came back to the investigators again and said, hey, when I didn't have the wire on, Mr. Prince has given me an account of the crime, and all of a sudden this account matches up much more closely with the facts. He's now saying that Mr. Prince confessed to him that he had murdered these 2 women. He adds in a sexual element that was not part of his original alleged confession that he had heard.
There was a wire around Angie's neck, and there was talk of trial about, well, detectives thought that Michael Hayes's confession that he had allegedly taken, this is credible because he knew about the wire, and detectives never released this information about the wire to the public. But it kind of came out in trial that wasn't necessarily true. That information had been leaked. So it was possible that other people, aside from people in the agency, could have known about this.
Yeah, so at the time of trial, it came out, as you said, that people in the community were aware that there had been a wire found around one of the victims' necks. Taking a step back, the alleged confession by Mr. Prince is nearly 2 years after the crime had occurred. So there was quite some time for that information to disseminate, and especially to disseminate in the prisons. And so with respect to the wire, there's testimony at trial that yes, the account of the wire had gotten out into the community, but there's also this sort of unclear testimony of, well, maybe it was a heater wire, or maybe it was, these various sorts of wires, and no one sort of says definitively, yes, it was this kind of a wire. Now, Mr. Hayes, I believe, says that it's a heater wire, and that is used as sort of a corroborating detail for this confession. We've since had an actual expert look at the wire, who's concluded that no, this was not an extension cord wire, this was a speaker wire. So even that one detail that is supposed to be corroborating of this confession, and again, take into account that this is sort of the third version of this confession that Mr. Hayes is giving, even that detail is in fact inconsistent with the physical evidence.
So there's errors in the confession, stories are changing, and as I understand it, Michael Hayes got a pretty good deal after he testified, or that's what it appears he got a pretty good deal after he testified in this case against Daniel Prince.
So what's interesting with sort of snitch testimony or jailhouse informant testimony is that very seldom are you going to be able to find any actual documentation that says, if you give us this testimony, we will give you this fantastic deal. It tends to be sort of hush-hush or an unspoken agreement. With respect to Mr. Hayes, at the time that he came forward, he was looking at 13 years. He was serving 2 sentences that would have been served concurrently. About a year or so after he came forward after getting the statement, he went to a court, and that got turned into 8 years, which with a good time allowed him to actually get good time parole after serving only 4 years. Additionally, and this did come out at trial, Mr. Hayes, who had sort of started as a farmhand, very quickly ends up with a job inside the prison. He becomes a jailhouse counsel without actually going through any of the training to become a jailhouse counsel. He is moved from Allen Correctional, where he had been with Mr. Prince, to another prison with a far lower security rating. So there's certainly indications that that he was receiving some sort of a benefit, even if there isn't sort of that handshake deal put into writing, that he was receiving some benefits for coming forward and providing this alleged confession.
And it sounds like this confession was what pushed the case forward against Daniel Prince. Investigators said they've been building evidence against him. He was one of their people of interest, but this confession is what they slapped it, or they arrested him immediately after they learned this information.
Yes, and it was certainly the information that the state relied upon at trial. I believe in the closing argument, the prosecutor even sort of referred to Mr. Hayes' testimony as the key piece of the linchpin of information here, the linchpin of the evidence. And this is actually pretty common, especially in capital cases and especially in capital wrongful convictions. The Center for Wrongful Convictions looked at all of the exonerations off of death row since death sentences came back in the 1970s, and found that in nearly 50% of those cases, the state's case had been built off of false jailhouse informant testimony. So this is sort of another one in a long line of cases, especially death penalty cases, where really the state is relying on that jailhouse informant testimony.
Wow. So this isn't the first time. Interesting. Another piece of evidence I want to talk about that was present in trial. We had many witnesses come forward and say, yes, we saw Daniel Prince at the bar that night, at the Little Easy, I think it was called. And Daniel Prince doesn't deny being there that night. He denies that he went home with the women, correct?
Yes, Mr. Prince has never denied that he was there. And I believe those same witnesses who said that they saw him there correctly also said that he had left before the 2 women had.
Yeah, I remember one person said, it was kind of all over the place. One person said they saw the two women leaving with a little gray-haired man. Daniel Prince was in his 30s. All over the place, right? With witness statements.
He certainly would not have matched a description of a little gray-haired man at that time. Yeah.
And another thing was this silver truck. Witnesses saw the women allegedly being followed by the silver truck, and then that night that they were killed and the mobile home was lit on fire, there was a silver truck leaving. And of course, we have Daniel Prince getting arrested in possession of a silver truck, but couldn't really nail down if it was the same truck that left the women's mobile home. There was some inconsistencies in the descriptions.
The accounts of the car passing by too, I believe the witness who said that she had seen this, it was that she happened to be looking out her trailer window sort of twice throughout that night. And we're talking about past 2 o'clock in the morning, and she just so happens to see this silver truck passing. Again, I mean, this is rural Acadia Parish. I don't know how unique the description of a silver truck is, but there certainly was nothing further to really confirm that that was Mr. Prince's truck. So, with respect to the silver truck, it was the specific silver truck that Mr. Prince was driving was never actually identified as being the same silver truck. And in fact, the witness who said she saw the silver truck at night driving by had said that the silver truck had tinted windows. All of the testimony was that the truck that Mr. Prince was driving did not have tinted windows. So even sort of the distinct features of the truck do not match up.
Cajun Case Files will be back after this. Cajun Case Files, a KLFY Plus original.
To me, these are kind of the three big pieces of information in this trial. Everything kind of came down to the confession, alleged confession of the witnesses seeing Daniel at the bar, and then this truck. Is there anything, other big, there was a lot of evidence that was presented, right? But I feel like these were the big three key pieces that really.
That was the only evidence ever really presented against Mr. Prince. Yes. And really, again, as the state said, the linchpin of this case was Michael Hayes' testimony about the alleged confession.
And the motive here is really iffy. I know in the confession, alleged confession, Michael Hayes says he had strangled the women. Daniel had strangled the women, stolen $2,500 from the dresser, and then lit it on fire. So the motive is $2,500. I mean, the motive wasn't really pinned down, it seems to me, in the trial.
Right. Well, and the initial statement again that Mr. Hayes said he heard was that Mr. Prince had seen a young man and his girlfriend, that the young man had flashed some cash, that Mr. Prince had decided he was going to rob him of that cash, and that things essentially got out of hand, and he had to kill them. Again, as your viewers, listeners probably know, the victims in this case were not a young man and a young woman. And then with respect to the women who were killed, numerous witnesses said they never saw these two women with large sums of cash. So that motive, which really is just a product of Michael Hayes' alleged confession, is never really borne out by any actual evidence.
Mm-hmm. And like you said at the beginning, that's all the evidence. There's no DNA evidence, but you guys are hoping maybe DNA evidence can be tested now, 20 years later, to prove this wasn't him. Since I'm assuming investigators still have all of this evidence collected, and something can be tested to prove it wasn't. Yeah.
There is still physical evidence. I think at this point, the likelihood that DNA testing is going to prove one way or another is probably pretty slim. And that's why our investigation has sort of gone in a different direction, really looking into Michael Hayes. One thing we didn't get into with Michael Hayes is that he told the jury that he had these two convictions that he was, upfront about. He was asked, how many convictions do you have? He said two. Turns out the records are pretty clear that Michael Hayes had a criminal history stretching back to 1993. What he said was his second conviction was, in fact, his ninth. He had a prior conviction for impersonating a police officer, and had really sort of rubbed law enforcement so wrong that when Mr. Hayes sued his prior attorney in one of these cases, that attorney actually had the local district attorney sign out an affidavit in which he said, and I want to make sure that I have this quote right because I don't want to be misattributing it, but the district attorney in this parish that had prosecuted Michael Hayes numerous times said he's generally considered to have no regard for the truth. We would be highly skeptical of any assertion made by Michael Lane Hayes that could not be completely and independently corroborated. And as we've discussed, there's no independent or complete corroboration of Mr. Hayes's account of the confession that he says he heard from Daniel Prince here.
So you guys are hoping to help Daniel by disproving Michael Hayes, something you think probably should have been done the first time around.
And it comes down to the fairness of a trial, especially a capital trial where the state was seeking to have the death penalty imposed. That one should absolutely have a fair trial no matter what. Even more importantly, under those circumstances. And one aspect of that is ensuring that the jury hears everything that they should hear about the state's main witness. In this case, they clearly did not.
What's Daniel saying? I've seen some, I don't want to get into my sources, but Daniel's claiming his innocence. Daniel has said he's innocent from day one back in 2007, 2005, even to now. Even a couple of years ago, he's still saying, I'm innocent. He has been actively gathering case files himself and researching the law himself because it seems like he's desperate to prove his innocence.
Absolutely. Mr. Prince has always maintained that he is innocent of this crime. I think I mentioned earlier that when we got involved in this case, Mr. Prince had actually already filed an application for post-conviction relief on his own. So he is adamantly fighting this. He has been ever since he was arrested for this crime. I should also add that Mr. Prince willingly talked to investigators after the crime. After the murders occurred, he spoke with police. He has been adamant about his innocence since the get-go, and I know is interested in moving towards being able to prove that. And that's one of the claims that we've made in our pleadings as well, is not just the unfairness of the underlying trial and the constitutional violations, but also that Mr. Prince, there is evidence, substantial evidence, that he is factually innocent of this crime.
We had talked a little bit before, off the record, and people who watched the first episode know there was another suspect in this case. I'm not allowed to speak on this suspect because he's never been officially charged or convicted in this case. But there's another person who was a suspect at this time. Can you speak on that at all?
I can speak on it to the extent that, yes, there was another suspect. As I mentioned earlier, this crime happened in January of 2005. Mr. Prince becomes a suspect based off of Michael Hayes's alleged hearing this confession in December of 2006. So we're talking nearly 2 years later. It would seem that the trail had gone somewhat cold for investigators, and they had moved off of their initial suspect. Yeah.
Can you give us the name?
Investigators, and this all came out of trial, investigators initially were looking at Jason Frugier, who was at that time dating one of the victim's daughters, and was seen at the scene afterwards. Mr. Frugier was also a volunteer fireman, and had, according to the investigators at trial, had been a suspect in other fires in the area.
Why do you think this person, Jason, that you mentioned, was dropped as a suspect in the end?
That I do not know. It would appear to me that clearly the trail went cold, but it would be just pure speculation on my part to give an opinion as to why that is. It did not come out at trial, I will say that.
What happens now in regards to Daniel?
So we are currently seeking an evidentiary hearing where we can put on our evidence and essentially have a judge decide whether Mr. Prince is entitled to a new trial or not. What happens when a conviction is overturned is that you are basically put right back into the pretrial position, and if the district attorney wants to retry you, they have the opportunity to do so.
I see. So then it would be back on the Acadia Parish DA to decide if he wants to go back and do this all over again.
Correct.
So it's safe to say you and your organization fully believe Daniel Prince is innocent in this case.
Yes. Yeah. And I guess to go back to the beginning when I was talking about kind of how we take cases, we are a nonprofit law firm that handles all of our cases pro bono. So we are not hired by individuals. We are not appointed by courts either. We only come onto cases if we've done the legwork and done the investigation and believe that someone is factually innocent and that we can prove that claim. And so that's certainly where we're at with Mr. Prince, and that's why we're hoping to move towards an evidentiary hearing.
More Cajun Case Files after this. Cajun Case Files, a KLFY Plus original.
You wanted to talk a little bit about snitch testimony, because that is the main thing that you guys are focusing this case on.
So you've got the first statement, which doesn't align with the facts at all. You've got the man and the woman, as opposed to two female victims. By the time we get to trial, Michael Hayes is still getting his facts wrong. Michael Hayes, when he's testifying at trial, says that the victim who is strangled with the electrical cord is Jackie Campbell. It's the person he describes as being the not heavy-set girl. If you look at the description of the victims, Angie Matt was listed at 5'5" and 140 pounds. Jackie Campbell was 5'1" and just under 100 pounds. Angie Matt is the one who is found with the cord around her neck. So he's getting, again, the description of what has happened to which victim wrong. And as we discussed earlier, his description of the wire is inconsistent with what an expert who has reviewed the evidence now says, which is that it was a speaker wire, not an electrical heater extension cord wire.
One thing I remember too is that I think this was brought up maybe in the appeals case, I can't remember, but it's interesting that there was no sexual assault kits done on either of the women, especially whenever I know it was maybe a year or two later, whenever this alleged confession came up, but there was no sexual assault kits. And the state fire marshal, someone in that office said, yeah, it was possible. And I told someone to do it, but it was never done. And that's some pretty big evidence that could have, A, exonerated Daniel Prince, and B, led them to the person who may have actually killed them.
Right. And it's clear that just simply was not done.
So whose fault is this? Is this a bad investigation? Is this an unfair trial? What do you think?
Typically with wrongful convictions, all of those things come together. Wrongful convictions are seldom ever about one act or one actor. It is a number of things that come together and deprive someone of a fair trial. And without a fair trial, we often get things wrong. And that's especially true when we talk about snitch testimony. What I do think is interesting in this case is that this is all happening just down the road from Church Point, Louisiana. One of the biggest scandals involving jailhouse informants in the United States was the conviction in federal court of a woman named Marianne Colomb, who was from Church Point, Louisiana. She and her three sons were alleged to have been running this huge cocaine conspiracy. By the time they went to trial, there were 16 jailhouse snitches who were prepared to be called to testify against them. It came out that there was essentially this jailhouse snitch ring going on where information was available to be bought. And the reason it came out is that one of the prisoners who was attempting to take advantage of this had sent over $2,000 to try and get this information to another prisoner. And when he didn't get the information, he reached out to the federal prosecutors asking that that other inmate be prosecuted. This all came out. Miss Colomb's conviction was overturned on a motion for new trial. And this all happened in 2006 in Louisiana for a woman from Church Point. So, it's interesting the way these things sort of interconnect, because here you got a case where the crime happened in 2005. The alleged statement from Mr. Prince is from December of 2006, right around the same time. And it's a similar situation where you've just got jailhouse snitch testimony being really the only testimony used to convict here.
We are talking today about Daniel Prince, but there's other people that are sitting in prisons right now, even in Louisiana, that have been wrongfully convicted, it sounds like.
Certainly. As I said earlier, our office has brought home 47 people from Louisiana and Mississippi who were wrongfully convicted. The state of Louisiana overall, I believe, has 87 folks who have been exonerated after serving some term of years for a crime they did not commit. What your listeners, your viewers should really know is that wrongful convictions happen all of the time. And it often takes these sort of big cases with serious charges for us to be made aware of them, but they happen really frequently. And what scares me is the number of cases, the small cases, where folks are charged with a crime they didn't commit, and they're looking at maybe going to trial a year from now, and they just say, I'll take the plea, time served, let me go, I don't want to do this. Another good example of that is this has been documented by the National Registry of Exonerations, but in, I believe it was 2016, somewhere around there, the Houston Crime Lab, which is really the only independent crime lab in the country, they changed their policy and went back and said, you know what, we're going to test drugs that were seized in drug arrest, and we're going to see if they were actually drugs or not. And as a result, I believe it was 122 people had their convictions overturned. And a number of those folks had pled guilty for exactly what I just mentioned before, that they didn't want to sit in prison waiting to go to trial. And so they took these pleas, even though, as it turned out, they were often not in possession of anything that was illegal.
Wow. I'm just taking a second to absorb all that information, because those are some scary statistics, and it can happen to anybody.
Right. And we're, as a society, I think, most appalled and terrified when it happens in a case like Mr. Prince's, where the state sought to execute him. as we should be. But we should also be aware that this happens really frequently, and in a lot of cases that we just don't have the statistics on.
If Innocence in Justice Louisiana gets Daniel's conviction overturned, the answer again becomes who killed Angie, Matt, and Jackie Campbell. Thanks for listening.